Welcome to Artwell. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. Today we are diving into the life and career of Joni Mitchell. It's a peculiar thing that one of the greatest singer-songwriters in history had no intention of ever being a singer or a songwriter. Ever since she was a child, Joni Mitchell, born Joan Anderson, wanted to be a painter. This calling led her from her home in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, to the Alberta College of Art in Calgary. However, her time at the art school was short-lived, and after becoming pregnant, she fled for the anonymity and opportunity of Toronto. While in Toronto, her passion for painting had to be put to the side and making money became her priority. Unsurprisingly, there was very little opportunity for an unmarried, pregnant art school dropout, and so Joni turned to the one way she knew how to make money: singing. While at school in Calgary, she had performed at local coffee houses to simply, as she put it, make some money for cigarettes and to go to the movies. The music scene in Toronto was more developed than it was in Calgary, and so work did not come easily to an unknown Joni. Unable to afford the union dues, she was relegated to performing at non-union gigs in places like church basements and YMCA meeting halls. She was not able to support herself or her daughter, and so she made the difficult decision to put her up for adoption. After that, her mission in life became to find a way to earn enough money so that she could bring her daughter home. And it was in that vulnerable state that she met the American folk rock singer Chuck Mitchell. Chuck told Joni that he could help her get steady work in coffee houses in Detroit and help her get her daughter back. And shortly thereafter, Joan Anderson became Joni Mitchell. Joni never was able to get her daughter back, but she was able to get steady work in Detroit coffee houses as part of a duo with her new husband, Chuck Mitchell. People were quick to catch on to the fact that there was a large gulf in talent between Joni and Chuck. And after issues in their relationship continued to arise, the marriage ended in divorce less than 2 years after it began. Now single, Joni devoted all of her time to her music, and her songs became famous before she did. Anyone who saw her perform was not only struck by her singing, but by her songwriting, and Joni's own hits were hits for other popular artists before they were hits for her, most notably The Circle Game by Tom Rush and Both Sides Now by Judy Collins. While her songs were hits on the radio for other people, Joni was hitting the road, touring extensively across the eastern seaboard in 1967 and touring again in 1968 to promote her debut album, Songs to a Seagull. The following year, her sophomore outing, Clouds, would see her increase in popularity before becoming a household name with 1970's Ladies of the Canyon, featuring Joni's most popular song, Big Yellow Taxi. Feeling like she was getting too famous too fast, Joni fled to Greece, a place she could be anonymous. When she did finally return, much to the delight of her management, she had written Blue, which was not only her most vulnerable album, but arguably the most vulnerable album written by anyone up to that point. And while reception for the album was mixed, Blue has gone on to be considered one of the greatest albums ever written. In 2021, Rolling Stone, who were initially critical of the album, ranked the album as number 3 in their list of 500 greatest albums of all time. On June 22nd, 2021, exactly 50 years to the day after the release of Blue, it charted on iTunes at number 1. 3 years after the release of Blue, Joni would reach her commercial peak with 1974's Court and Spark, before experimenting more and more with the jazz sound throughout the rest of the decade, a decision that would alienate a large contingent of her audience. This exploration culminated in 1979's Mingus, a collaboration between Joni Mitchell and the legendary jazz bassist Charles Mingus before his death that same year. After raging against the machine in the greedy 80s, as she described them, Joni's popularity would surge into the 1990s, with a new generation of songwriters citing her as one of their greatest influences. And she proved just how great she was by winning not 1, but 2 Grammys for her 1994 album Turbulent Indigo, including the Grammy for Best Pop Album. And around this time, it felt like every single publication in the world was jumping onto Joni Mitchell's popularity by awarding her some form of honorary award. Shortly after reuniting with her daughter in 1997, Joni Mitchell would not write another song for almost a decade, citing the fact that she started writing when she lost her daughter, and now that she had her daughter back, she had no reason to do so, and instead was going to focus her time on being a newfound mother and grandmother. And after suffering an aneurysm in 2015, it was thought that Mitchell would never sing again. However, the odds were never something that Joni Mitchell paid much attention to. As a polio survivor in her youth, she was told she would never walk again. And that was something she felt she didn't have to listen to. And as for her singing, well, Mitchell returned to the stage in 2022. Ever the artist, she continues to sing and paint to this day, and she will continue to do so every day until she dies. Every single Artwell deep dive is connected to the one that came before it. And last time out, we did a deep dive into the life and career of Keith Jarrett, who's considered by many to be one of, if not the greatest jazz piano players of all time. And the connection then is in 1971, the same year that Blue came out, Keith Jarrett covered the song All I Want, which is the opening song on Blue, and he covered it in his 1971 album, The Morning of a Star. And when I read that, I remember exactly where I was. I was reading a Wikipedia page about The Morning of a Star, and it mentioned the fact how he covered this song by Joni Mitchell. And up to this point, I truthfully didn't really know much about Joni Mitchell at all. If I'd heard any of her songs, it would have been Big Yellow Taxi, and truthfully, I'd probably heard another version of Big Yellow Taxis and not even Joni's. So I don't know if I'd ever listened to any Joni music up to this point. This was a month and a half ago. And so when I read that in the Wikipedia page, I was like, let me go listen to this song and both versions of the song. And so I put it on, and I think I listened to the Keith one first. Actually, I listened to it in reverse. I listened to the Joni one first, and it stopped me in my tracks. I was like, this is one of the most beautiful songs I think I've ever heard. And it was in that moment where I was like, oh, Joni Mitchell's going to be the next deep dive. That's the connection. This is the path I want to go down. I want to learn more about Joni Mitchell because this song is incredible. I naively assumed that All I Want was going to be not only the biggest song off of Blue, but one of her biggest songs ever at that point. And it's not. It really isn't. If you look at, I use Spotify as a benchmark for this stuff because you can see what songs people listen to more than others. And there are a number of songs not just in her entire catalog, but off of Blue that get more plays. But either way, that was the connection. Keith Jarrett covered All I Want. I listened to All I Want. I thought it was incredible. And I decided in that moment, Joni Mitchell is the next deep dive. And before we get into the deep dive, I want to remind you that if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the Artwell podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you go over and subscribe to the podcast, because after the deep dive, which I think is going to be 2 parts, I'm going to be putting out a third bonus content episode of everything that didn't make it into the deep dive. So I have, 10 pages worth of notes of additional material that I'm going to be sharing with you as an audio exclusive. So if you haven't already, make sure you go and subscribe to the Artwell podcast. And if you want to get even more out of the show, you can subscribe to the Artwell newsletter. At the Artwell newsletter, what I do is after the deep dive is completed, I think I put this out the exact same time that I put out the bonus content episode, I'm going to send you an email directly to your inbox, which is going to include all of the lessons that we talked about over the course of this deep dive. And I'm going to write those lessons as these short little one-liners to make them memorable. You call them maxims, I like to call them lessons, whatever you want. But I write them as these short little one-liners to make them memorable for you. So you can subscribe to the Artwell podcast and the Artwell newsletter at the link in the show notes.
Every human being, across all time and space, we've been hardwired for stories.
There are no breaks in this business. You make your breaks.
The reason I'm in this room right now is because my music's very dope.
Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later.
Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
You're only given a little spark of madness. And if you lose that, you're nothing.
And where I want to start with Joni Mitchell is her writing process. Because Joni is considered by many to be one of the greatest songwriters ever. And even though the word songwriter is something Joni refuses to accept many labels. She kind of just likes artist as a good catch-all term, because is she a songwriter? Is she a poet? What is she? But anyways, she's considered by many to be one of the greatest songwriters of all time. So I want to start with her writing process. And part of the reason the lyrics in her music and her poems are so good is because she stresses about every single word that's in her poems or in her lyrics. And there's this quote from Melody Maker, which was a magazine. The journalist that wrote this piece was named Jacob Atlas. This was from 1970. And he said, Joni insists that her lyrics be worked over until every word is absolutely necessary and cannot be altered. There's no fluff in her lyrics. Every single word has justified its existence. And that reminds me of something we talked about in the fourth deep dive on the show into George Miller, who is the director, writer, creator of the Mad Max franchise. And George has this exact same philosophy. But for him, it pertains to the writing, but it also pertains to the making of the film. When you look at any frame in a George Miller movie, you need to be able to point to anything that you see on the screen in that one frame, and you have to be able to justify that thing. Everything on screen must justify its existence. If not, then why is it there? It should be removed. Because anything that doesn't justify its existence gets in the way of the audience experience of receiving what it is you're trying to communicate through your art. And Joni Mitchell is the exact same way with her writing. Every single word must justify its existence because it must contribute to helping her communicate what it is she is trying to communicate with the listener of her song. And if it does not do that, then why is that word there? It's a tedious process. It's not an easy process, but it is necessary in order to write great songs. And Joni was tenacious in how she approached this writing. She said, I would get an idea and I'd stick with it until whatever it was completed. I would work and work and work. You couldn't wrench me away from it. Not only could you not wrench her away from it, she wouldn't even know if you were trying to do that. She almost married Graham Nash, who is another famous singer. He's in Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And he was saying that when they were together and she was writing, and this is, I want to say like late 60s, early 70s. When he was with her and she was writing, he said the word he used to describe her kind of like mental state was gone. Like she would be there physically, but when she was working on her music, you could speak to her and she wouldn't answer you. But she wouldn't answer you because she was ignoring you. She wouldn't answer you because she wouldn't even hear you. Your words would not get through to her because she was so engrossed in this process that the entire world kind of fell away. When she was into a song, when she's into a painting, that is all that mattered to her. She would get lost in it. But not only would she get lost in it, she would stick with it until the piece was done. Until every single word justified its existence. And I want to be clear with something here. When I'm talking about how every single word has to justify its existence, I'm not necessarily saying that Joni is striving to make her art perfect. I think there's a difference between creating a masterpiece and creating perfection. Perfect, I actually have a definition here from Merriam-Webster. And perfect is being entirely without fault or defect. And if I were to hazard a guess, I would say Joni is not looking to make a song that is without fault. And I have a quote of hers here that I think is going to back me up on that. She said, I think that there's a lack of romance in everything today. I went to see the film version of Romeo and Juliet, which is supposed to be the epitome of romance. And I thought it was very unromantic. Everything was too perfect. And so I think what this quote is saying, why I'm confident in saying that I don't think Joni was striving for perfection, is because perfection isn't interesting. What makes something interesting, what makes it stand out is its defects. You know, I think something that is perfect, it can just kind of like float by you. And I think we're going to start to see this in today's world when it comes to advancements in AI, right? And technology. I think technology and specifically AI is going to allow you to create films that are quote unquote perfect. They're like perfectly engineered to be exactly what people are watching, exactly what people want to watch. Every single cut is going to be based by some data-driven decision. The topic of the film is going to be based off of data of what people are watching, what they want to watch. And I think that that's going to create something passable, right? Like something you could waste 2 hours watching. But I don't think it's going to live up to art that's made by humans. I think that there's going to be something about the imperfection that is what draws us to something, right? Like, while I'm not doing interviews with the show right now, I have done interviews with the show in the past, and all of these incredible artists that I spoke to talked about at some point some mistake that they made in the process that made the film or the song or the game better. And the example I think of is in the movie Rain Man. So I got to interview John Seal. John Seal is the cinematographer of Rain Man. He's also just one of the greatest cinematographers of all time. He was nominated for an Oscar in 4 straight decades. He not only did do Rain Man, he did Dead Poets Society, he did Mad Max Fury Road, he did Cold Mountain, The English Patient, which he won an Oscar for. He did Witness, he did Harry Potter 1, Perfect Storm. John Seal is that guy when it comes to cinematography. And there's a shot in Rain Man where, this isn't really a spoiler for Rain Man, there's a scene where Tom Cruise's character and Rain Man are coming down a escalator. They're in Vegas, they're going to a casino. And they're coming down an escalator, and this light goes up the two of them. It's this iconic shot from the movie, this like light that goes up them as they come down the escalator. That light was an accident. They were kind of setting up for the shot, and there was basically the light reflected off of something onto the escalator. And they did the shot, and this guy came running over to John. He was like, "John, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that the light was reflecting that way. I'm going to go take it down right now." And John was like, "If you go and fix that, you're fired." He's like, "It's beautiful. Don't change it." And John says that happens to him on every film he worked on. He said he skated by on his career through these things he called lucky mistakes. And I think it is those imperfections that make art interesting. It is your flaws that make you unique. And so I think that when something becomes too perfect, it just becomes uninteresting. And I use the word perfect on the show in the past. Like I often say, strive for perfection. I don't think you'll ever get there, but it is the pursuit of perfection that allows you to make something, to make a masterpiece. And I still agree with that. And I think that there's that distinction between perfection and a masterpiece. I think a masterpiece still has flaws, but the flaws do not detract from it, if that makes sense. And I think Joni here, when she's writing her songs, when she is stressing about every single piece, she's not doing so for the sake of perfection. She's doing so for the sake of communicating exactly what it is she has to communicate. And so if she's not writing for perfection, I think actually this is the punchline here. I think she's not writing for perfection. I think she's writing for simplicity. But simplicity does not mean lack of effort. It does not mean dumb. She said, in order to be simplified, again, not dumb, not easy. I think in order to create something that is simple, it actually requires a lot of work. Because in order to be simplified, it has to be honed down more. It takes a lot more polishing for that simplicity than it did for anything complicated. And this is something we talked about actually on the last deep dive with Keith Jarrett, is simplicity as an artist is what you should be striving for. And I think the Keith Jarrett quote is something along the lines of like, the more talented you become as an artist, the more you realize simplicity is profound. And I think of the bell graph, of a bell graph when it comes to simplicity as an artist. When you start out as an artist, whatever your art form is, writing, singing, songwriting, filmmaking, your work is naturally going to be simple just because you don't have the tools or the skill set in order to make something that is complex. So your work is naturally going to be simple. But then you're going to develop as an artist. You're going to acquire more skills. You're going to learn about more tools. And your work is going to start to become complex just because you have so many things at your disposal and you know how to use them all, but you don't know how to use them all cohesively. And so that's the middle of the bell graph, where you're doing too much with your work. You're trying to be profound by being complex. You're using all of these new techniques and things you've learned. But then as you continue to progress as an artist, you realize that you have to make it simple once again. But it's taking all of these complex things and making the work appear simple. Whereas the beginner is simple with lack of ability, a master is simple with ability, with all of the complexity kind of working underneath it. The example I like to cite is Mad Max Fury Road, the George Miller movie. It is, on its surface, incredibly simple. They steal a truck, they drive it across the desert, they realize it's a mistake, they turn the truck around, they drive back across the desert. They're being chased the whole way by the bad guys. That's Mad Max Fury Road in a nutshell. But if you analyze the film and you dig into it, you'll see that there's so much complex stuff happening underneath it. I did this video with this guy named Mike Hill. He's a concept designer. He's worked on Dune, Blade Runner 2049, Love, Death, and Robots. He has reading the comments, not necessarily on my video, he reposted it, and reading the comments on his, it's a very divisive video. The video, in terms of what Mike is saying, is nothing to do with my opinion. This is Mike's opinion, but he has this reading of the film that is incredibly complex. I think there's some validity to what he's saying. There might not be validity to some other things that he's saying. You might disagree with Mike, and that's okay. The point of the video and why I did it with Mike was to show that a couple of things, that your interpretation of a film, if you see something is there, that doesn't mean that the filmmaker intended for it to be there, but it also doesn't mean that what you see is wrong. But I did it to showcase that this simple movie actually has a lot of complex symbolism that could be picked up on. And so I think that what Joni is going for in her songwriting isn't perfection, it is this simplicity. But it is this simplicity that is intentional and is complex underneath the surface. And the reason I think she is going for that, and why other artists strive for this profound simplicity, is because I think simple is transmissible. Like if you are trying to communicate something in your work, the best way to do that is to make it easy for someone to receive what it is you have to share. And when you overcomplicate it, it makes it harder for people to pick up on anything because there's too much going on. They lose the signal amongst the noise. And so by making something simple, you're taking that noise away so that they are able to easily pick something up in what it is that you've made. But what exactly are you trying to share? Right? Like there has to be some substance to what you're making. Like it can't just be style. There has to be some substance there. You know, it's not just about, like in Joni's case, it's not just about how the words sound. It's what the words are saying. You know, the way she puts it is, first of all, I'll write something down and then I think, oh, I like how the words sound together, but it doesn't say anything. You want your work to say something, right? And there's this idea that's going to come up throughout the course of this deep dive, if there's a part 2 and part 1 and part 2. And this is idea of art versus craft. And craft is your ability as an artist. You can make something that is technically proficient. Art is making something with the intention of communicating something. It's using the skill set that you have in order to communicate something. You know, I come back to this quote all the time. I interviewed John Cawley, who is a screenwriter. He wrote Master and Commander, which is like an 8-time Oscar-nominated film. He wrote Happy Feet Part 1, He co-wrote Hotel Mumbai, Monkey Man. And I asked him, what does it mean to you to do art well? And he told me to communicate emotion with intentionality. And that to me is the art piece. The craft is you might be able to make, or another example of this, you might be able to make a technically proficient film and you're a very good craftsman, but the artist is the one who can, again, make you feel something when you watch it. To bring it back to John Seale, again, the cinematographer, he worked a lot with the British director Anthony Minghella. And Anthony Minghella was a many times Oscar-nominated director. And John's son made a film. And Anthony wanted to see it. So John's son shows Anthony Minghella this film. Anthony watches it, doesn't say anything. The film ends, and he goes, with this film, you have shown me you know how to make a film. But now I want you to put 2 people up against a brick wall and make me cry. That to me is a perfect summation of art versus craft. Art is the ability to communicate emotion with intentionality. Craft is what gives you the tools to do so. And so I think that when it comes to Joni Mitchell here, what she's saying, where the words sound good but doesn't say anything, the words sound good, like there's craft here. I've done this thing well. But for it to be art, I have to say something. And she actually ran into this issue with Bob Dylan later in his career, where he was talking about how, I haven't written a song, like truly written a song in a long time. She was like, what are you talking about? Like, you're putting out songs. And Bob's like, yeah, but there's nothing there. Like, he's just doing the thing because he knows how to do the thing. But he didn't really have anything to say. He was like falling back kind of into his comfort zone. And he had nothing to say. There was no art there. It was all craft. It was just falling back on the skill. And for Joni, that was never an option. She refused to just become a craftsman or a craftswoman. She was and will forever be an artist. And that is how she approached her writing. She wouldn't settle for, sounds good. She would work at it until it said something, and said something genuine to her that she felt. And I think this is the problem with our world today. I think we have a lot of really, really, really talented craftspeople, especially in a social media world, right? Like on social media, so many incredibly talented creatives, but we don't have as many artists, right? Because people are getting so good at like making a thing that is manufactured to get clicks and views, but we don't have people who can tell stories that make you feel something. And I think that is important because it is art that helps you push the culture forward. Craft doesn't push you forward. And again, Joni Mitchell throughout her entire career was an artist, even from the time that she was young. She was a painter from the time she was a child. And I think the first time she realized she was also a writer, she could be a writer, was I think around the 6th or 7th grade. And she has this teacher who was very influential on her. She mentioned him a lot throughout her career, especially at the beginning part of her career. I believe she dedicated one of her albums to him, or he was included in the dedication. And his name was Arthur Kratzman. And Arthur was an Australian English teacher. And he kind of gives me the vibes of Professor Keating from Dead Poets Society. He walked into class, Joni says, the way she tells it is he walked into class, he held up the curriculum. He said, there's nothing in here that's going to help you in life. I can help you. I can teach you all this in less than a week. So you'll all pass the exam with flying colors. And I'm going to teach you everything that I know about life in this class, essentially. And one thing he said to Joni was, if you can paint with colors, you can paint with words. And she would say that a lot throughout her career as well. And she would come back to that quote a lot because it gave her permission to write and to view writing as something not the same, but allow her to express herself in a way that she could with painting, she could now do with words. And she was a very talented writer, and Kratzman identified that in her. He knew that she was a good writer, and he pushed her harder than some of the other students. Like there was this story she tells where she's sitting in class, she gets her poem back, and she's got a B. And she looks over at the boy next to her, and he's got an A. And she's read his poem, and his poem is not very good. Like her poem is objectively better. And so she waits around after class, and she goes up to Kratzman, and she goes, you gave me a B, but this other boy, you gave me an A. Are you trying to say my poem is not as good as his poem? And Kratzman looked at her and he said, oh no, like your poem is definitely better. And she was like, well then why did he get an A and I only got a B? And he went, because that poem is the best thing that boy will ever write. I know you can do better than that. And so he identified this talent in Joni, and he nurtured her artistic impulses, and he made her better. And I think that is just the hallmark of an incredible teacher. And another piece of advice that he gave her is one time Joni wrote this poem, and she got the poem back, and Kratzman had circled like all over her poem in red ink. He'd circle it cliché, circle it cliché, circle it cliché. And again, pushing Joni to be better. He's like, if it's cliché, then just identify it as a cliché and work at it until you can say that in a way that isn't. And this is advice Joni would give to other songwriters. She would take this advice that Kratzman gave her when she was like 12, and she would tell songwriters, is just go through your song after you've written it, and anything that's a cliché, circle it and then replace it with something that isn't cliche. I like one, I just like this idea is to make sure you don't have cliches in your work. But two, I think that you can kind of take that technique and extrapolate it to other things you're not good at. Like this, the way Joni looked at it, she would look at cliches in her work to make sure that those things weren't in there. But what is something in your work that you know you're bad at? Next time you review your work, review it with just that one thing in mind. There's going to be a million other little things you could probably change and fix, but just focus on the thing you're bad at. And how can you just be better at the thing you're bad at? Like in Joni's case, when your writing is cliche, how can you just identify the cliche and then work at it until it's no longer cliche? Whatever it is you're bad at, identify that in your work and then just fix those things. It reminds me of this technique. I quote him a lot on here. This is not a business podcast, clearly, but there's this entrepreneur I really like. His name's Alex Hormozi. He's also a writer, though, so I think this holds here. But he talks about whenever he's looking at anything, whether it be a video, his book, a pitch deck or something, he writes out basically all of the things he wants to look for in his reviews. You know, for example, cliches could be one, spelling errors could be another, pacing could be another. And he will then go through whatever it is he's reviewing, the video, his book, and he will just go through with each individual, he will go through the thing a time for each individual thing he wants to check for. He will just look for spelling mistakes, and then he'll read it again, and he'll just look for cliches, and then he'll read it again, and he'll just pay attention to the pacing because it allows him to focus on that thing. I think we do this a lot. I mean, I do this a lot, is whenever I'm reviewing anything, this is also part of the social media game. It's like, I only want to review it once or twice. I don't want to review it that many times. But like, I will try and pick up on everything when I review it. And naturally, if you're trying to pick up on everything, you're going to miss some things. And so by this dialed in revision strategy allows you to improve the things you're bad at and make specific improvements and pick up on more errors than if you just kind of read it willy-nilly, or you just go through your work a couple passes and just pick up on what you see versus intentionally looking for things you know either that you will have likely done wrong, or looking intensely for things that you know you're bad at to correct those errors. And one of those things for Joni was her cliches. But obviously I think it's a balance though. Like, I don't think, if you know you're bad at it, obviously try to correct it in the first draft, but don't make your first draft entirely about like not catching about not writing cliches. I am a big fan and a big believer of your first draft should be uninhibited. And I think as you progress as a writer, like using Joni's cliche thing as the example, as you progress as a writer, you're naturally just going to have less and less cliches in your writing on a first draft, even if you're not thinking about it. Like, it'll just become subconscious to you. But I think that, again, I'm a big fan of your first draft being uninhibited. And the way Joni would write is she would write the way she describes it as copious amounts and then condense it. Like I don't have the quote in front of me, but she talked about there was one song she had where she had 60 verses written for this song. And she would pick like 4 for the final version or 3 for the final version. She would cut 57. And I find that, one, I like that as a strategy of this idea of, not even a strategy is not the right word, but like, I like that as an approach. Uninhibited. Write as much as you feel you need to, and then condense it down to the best version possible. And I use this advice. So for context, for fun, I work with this event in Toronto where I live called Playlist Storytellers. Playlist Storytellers is a storytelling event where 4 storytellers come in, they tell a story about their lives that has a song involved in the story somehow. So they tell the story in front of an audience, and then the song plays when they're done. And this event is put on by my friend Danny Desatnik. It's a great event. I love it. But he asked me to be his story director. So I work with all of the storytellers at this event to help them refine their stories, make their stories better, make these stories work for the format. And this is one of the pieces of advice that I give pretty much every single storyteller. Our stories are supposed to be 8 to 10 minutes long. And that question often comes up a lot when I'm meeting storytellers for the first time about the time frame. And what I always tell any of them is, do not worry about the time limit until we're doing your second draft. Write this story in the best, in the way you want to write it. Put everything in there that you think should be in there. And then we'll work on it after to refine it and condense it. I think that's one of my skills when it comes to working with these storytellers, is this refining process of what to cut, what to keep, how to condense. Because we can peel a bunch of things away. But if you take something out in the first draft, I'm not going to know to put it back in. It's never coming back in, and it might need to be there. It might be important, but because you were writing your first draft with like the time limit in mind or with a budget in mind and like another context, it's forcing you to take things out that should be there. Do not let reality come into the first draft. Write as much as you want. You can always take it out later. And it is in this pursuit, like for Joni, like I said, she wrote 60 verses. She only needed 3 or 4. Might have been verse 58 that was really good. That might have been one of the 3 verses she kept. Imagine if she only wrote 3 verses, or if she only wrote 7. It was the 57th, the 58th that made it in. So just go and go and go until you feel like you've said everything you need to say. And then let reality come in. Let the format come in. You know, for Joni, obviously she's not going to do a song with 60 verses. So let the fact that she's doing a 3-4 minute song come into play. Do not let anything influence your first draft. Write it completely uninhibited. Do not let fame, do not let money, do not let expectations, do not let the format influence it. Just write it so that you express everything you want to express and then refine it. And for Joni, you know, she's writing these songs with sometimes 60 verses. Who is she writing for? I think this is really interesting because when it comes to, I talked about like these data-driven decision-making, is a lot of this data-driven decision-making is happening because art now, when I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking of like in a film context. I think it also applies in a music context. But like things are being made now with the expectation of reaching as many people as possible. And there's a cliche saying of like, if you make something for everyone, you're actually going to make it for no one. And I think that a lot of this like art that is becoming too perfect is actually what that means. It is becoming not simple, because we already used that word, but it is becoming so dumbed down that it can be applicable to anyone from anywhere without offending anyone from anywhere. But then it actually also, if it's not, it also then doesn't connect with anyone from anywhere. And it's because it's trying to reach everyone, everywhere. And Joni took a complete inverse approach. Joni was only writing for a couple of people. She said, when I finish a new song, I take it and I play it for my friends who are fine musicians and writers. I'm very impressed by their reaction to it. If they like it, I'm knocked out. I guess I write for those people. That's really my audience. Joni wasn't writing for her fans. She wasn't writing for who she thought her fan was. She was just writing for her friends. And this quote was said in the late 60s. I want to sidebar on this quickly when I talk about making something for your friends and not making something for everyone. When she's talking, this quote specifically is said when she lived in Laurel Canyon. Laurel Canyon is in California. I believe it's in Los Angeles. And Laurel Canyon was like a scene in the late 60s. A bunch of musicians, obviously including Joni, all moved to Laurel Canyon at the same time. All of these like rock singers, folk singers maybe, all moved there at the exact same time. And so you have a lot of just all of these talented people in close proximity, hanging out together, working together, sharing music together, getting feedback from one another. And like, just to give context to this, this was like, when it comes to like late 60s rock, late 60s American rock, this is like the equivalent of like the surrealists in Paris in the 1920s, or like the Renaissance period in Italy, where you have all these talented painters living in close proximity together. You have this a little bit in the future with the movie brats, right? Like all these really talented directors who all became friends and kind of came up together. This is happening in Laurel Canyon, all these people living together. And I have this obsession with scenes where you have this, all just this density of talent in close physical proximity that all go on to do great things. Like, for example, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, but before there was Young involved, it was just Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Crosby, Stills, and Nash, which went on to become, again, a huge band, was formed in Joni Mitchell's living room because they were just friends hanging out. And I think this is a secret to the secret to a scene is that when it comes to this Laurel Canyon scene, what was kind of bringing everybody together wasn't being famous. It was about music and making great music and sharing music with your friends. And that's who you're writing for. And what came out of that was really beautiful music that was written for specific people, but that applied to so many. And so in this Laurel Canyon scene, I think the lesson here too is the driving force for all these musicians was sharing music with your friends, sharing music with other people in the scene. And I think that that is a critical part of the development of a scene, is that everything in what is happening in the scene is done for the scene itself, right? Like not for the sake of fame or money or for making a scene. It is literally done for the people that are a part of this community or this scene, right? Like you're making music to share with other people that are living in this area with you. You know, or when you're the movie vets, you're making movies and you want to get the feedback of your friends on your movie. Or the surrealists, you know, they're making things to one-up each other as surrealists. And I say that because I remember I live in Toronto. I was going to this like events page somewhere, and just like events in the city. And I saw this post about the formation of scenes, and we're trying to make a scene here in Toronto with people that are like this and like this and like this. And I don't think you can manufacture a scene. I think a scene has to happen organically. I think a scene has to be created for, I say the scene itself, like for the people who are there. Like that is, you all are just making things and sharing them with each other. Versus like this event I saw in Toronto, we're trying to make a scene in Toronto. You're making things with a different motive. You're making things to make a scene, not making things to share with your friends, and not becoming a scene as a byproduct. And so this people in this scene in Laurel Canyon in the late 1960s is who Joni Mitchell was writing for. And these songs that Joni was writing for her friends in Laurel Canyon were songs about her life. And I guess potentially even partially their lives. Like Joni would mine her life, her experiences, her relationships for material and inspiration for her music. But like for her, the process of writing a song was like the creative process was the act of processing her life and experiences on the page. Like it's a very cliche thing, but you write to understand. Joni Mitchell was no different. She was trying to wrap her head around these things that are happening, these feelings that she's having on the page. But in order to do that, you need time. Because what's interesting is that Joni says that you can't write about a moment in the moment because you need a different perspective on the moment than the one you have right now. Like if you're too emotional, you can't write about it clearly enough. That's not to say you forget the emotion, because you actually want this new perspective and your original perspective. And you want these two to kind of play against each other to create a level of friction, which creates something unique. Like the way that Joni puts it is, it's just standing back and getting another perspective on it. I step back and carry on a conversation with myself. It's almost schizophrenic. You lay out a case and argue with yourself about it and with no conclusions. But I have to write a long time after something has happened, because when I'm in the middle of something, I'm totally emotional and blind and I can't get perspective on it. And I like that as an idea of this idea of like arguing with yourself, right? And that is when I say we write to understand, because there is necessarily no right answer. And so you need to give it time, because it's hard to be objective in the moment. But again, don't forget that feeling, right? Because I think that you need the perspective to be able to process it, but you need the emotion in order to make it feel real. And again, to bring it back to Kratzman, Joni's middle school teacher, he said this to her, alluding to this Nietzsche quote, where he told Joni, you have to learn to paint and to write in your own blood. I'd never heard that quote before. I'd never heard it from Nietzsche, but I think that's such a fire quote. Like you have to, and this is a feeling I had too, is like, when I think of my writing, when I think of my screenplays, there's a couple of them where it's like I look back and I'm like, oh, I was just, even actually not even the ones that look back. I've been trying to get back into screenwriting actively, and I'm writing at one and I'm having a lot of resistance. And I think it's because it just feels like something I'm just trying to like do the thing. I'm not actually saying anything with it. I'm not like the way I used to think about it is like, I'm not cutting myself open and bleeding on the page. I'm not putting any of me into this, but that's what you have to do if you want art to resonate. You have to learn to write in your own blood. And so I think when Joni says you need perspective in order to write something, I do think that's valid, but I think my caveat in all of this is there is a level of rawness when you're in the middle of something that I think you should capture with the writing. I don't think it's necessarily the final form, but I think that, again, there is benefit to writing in the moment. And so the little one-liner I wrote here that I think encapsulates what Joni's saying, kind of my feelings towards this, is like, you want to write emotionally and refine with perspective. Write emotionally, refine with perspective. And that's not an easy thing to do, right? I mean, just the act of like opening your heart up and putting it onto the page is difficult. And so for Joni, she would often write, she needs to write alone. She would seek out solitude. And part of the reason is she likes to write and paint throughout the night because no one can bother her. She even later on in her career, after Blue came out, actually, she bought a property up in British Columbia, Canada, and she went and moved there. She went to British Columbia, Canada, and she went and kind of just lived in nature in this like little stone hut for a year and wrote her next album there, For the Roses. And she just seeks out this solitude when she's writing. And I think, and she kind of had this pattern often where she would every couple months a year, she would go back to her cottage in British Columbia. And I think that is, or her home in British Columbia. And I think that that's like the ideal situation for a writer, is like to go to the city, to be in contact with people and to experience life, and then to go back somewhere quiet, to process everything that's happened and to write about it. And because when you're trying to wrestle with these things you've gone through, you need the solitude and the peace to go as far, the way Joni puts it, is like to go as far inside herself as she needed to in order to wrestle with, she calls it a theme, but like the thing she's struggling with. She needed solitude in order to do that. And the song would not be finished until she came to some level of understanding of how she felt in the moment and of this new perspective she was bringing to it. She had, while there is no right answer, she had to find some level of understanding. And if she didn't understand what it was she was trying to say, the song was not done. He said, it got to a point where the only time that I could tell when a song was finished was when I had cut through layers and layers of my own vagaries until I got to a point where I understood something about myself, at which point I would feel lighter. It would lighten something in me, and that's when I knew that was the pertinent thing that song should contain. And there's a few things I want to pull out here, and obviously there's the point of like her talking about how if she didn't understand the song was not done. But I don't want to pull that out. I want to pull out vagaries, and I want to pull out the pertinent thing that song should contain, because the two things are really, really important here. I think when she's talking about vagaries here, vagaries in this context is the complexity, and the understanding is simplicity, right? Because I think of the vagaries, when she's talking about cut through the layers and layers of my own vagaries, is human beings are complicated creatures. You don't just feel one specific way about something. But when you're putting something in a song, you have to reach some form of understanding. You have to get to some like kind of clear and coherent point to be able to share that with the audience, right? So you have to kind of work through this place where all these complex things that are going on up in your head, all this like vagueness, to get to one point, to some level of understanding so that other people can understand how you're feeling as well. And so that point we talked about earlier, where it's like you have to work through the complex in order to get to something simple, is kind of rearing its head here. It's showing up again in terms of how her cutting through the layers and layers of her own vagaries, because you can hide behind those, right? Joni liked to quote Nietzsche a lot. And this was specifically in reference to poets and why she doesn't necessarily like poets and their writing, and Joni being a poet in this context. She used to say how, poets, or Nietzsche would say, poets often muddy the water so that they can appear deep. And that is what Joni is making sure she's not doing here. She's making sure that what she is saying is, she's not muddying the water. She's making it abundantly clear what she is trying to say. And in order to do that, she has to cut through all of the complexity and get to something simple, something clear. And when she's identified what that is, she is then able to go back and rewrite the song through that perspective. Like once she comes to that understanding of what this song is actually about, it gives her a theme that she can use to revise the song. And that's where I think where she's talking about the pertinent thing. When I knew that that was the pertinent thing that song should contain, that's when I knew that was the pertinent thing that song should contain. That tells her what the song is about. So she can now rewrite the song through the perspective of this theme, of this pertinent thing that the song is about. So she has to strip all of this vagueness away in order for her to understand what she's actually communicating. And then that allows her to more easily communicate it throughout the entire song. And the thing with trying to come to an understanding is sometimes Joni is asking such big questions that it's hard to come to an understanding. She describes her process as a process of inquiry, asking big questions to try and understand. And her writing, like we said, is something that she does to try and think clearly, to kind of organize her thoughts, to clear up the vagueness of what she has. But the thing with trying to do that, especially as you progress as a human being and as an artist, is the questions that you are asking become more and more complex. The way Joni puts it is, I really don't know, because the questions get more and more like a catch-22. I think as I grow older, I realize more and more that there are no answers. So even the questions become more futile than they did when I was in my early 20s. And she uses the word futile there, but I actually think that those big questions that have no answers are important. And I believe that, or I think that, because of a conversation that I had with Nadia Townsend. Nadia Townsend is a dramaturg, which is a difficult thing to try and explain. But essentially what a dramaturg is somebody who helps actors understand the essence of the essence of the drama of the thing that they're performing, and then helps them to capture that essence in their performance. It's not an acting coach. It's kind of, it's not quite that. It's more emotional, more about, again, the drama. And Nadia worked with George Miller on Mad Max Fury Road. She worked with George Miller and with Nicola Thuris, who's another dramaturg and co-writer of Mad Max Fury Road. And she worked with them on the film, and she talked about George's own process of inquiry, like what Joni has here. And what was so interesting is I'd listened to hundreds of George Miller interviews. I think that's one of the most I've ever done for an Art World Deep Dive. It was like 230 something. And I'd heard this never got brought up in any of the interviews that I'd listened to. And so this was incredibly interesting to me when Nadia talked about it, is George fosters an environment of people asking big questions. He wants you to ask these big, unanswerable questions, both just about the art itself and the way we do things, but also just about life. Because by asking these big questions with no right answer that don't even potentially even have an answer, you're going to get people who are thinking deeply, who are going to come to some form of conclusion or some form of answer that is going to be more interesting than people who aren't asking big questions. You're going to come up with ideas and thoughts that people are unable of coming up with unless they ask these big questions. And so while Joni calls asking these questions futile, I actually think they are an incredibly important part of developing and growing as an artist. They are how you push yourself into new areas, because by asking these big questions, you are forcing yourself to have thought patterns that are new to you, that are going to lead you to new ideas and conclusions and learnings that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And so that is Joni's process. She does a very similar thing that George Miller does. Granted, George Miller does it in a team environment, and he's so encouraging of it that this is another thing Nadia told me that nobody had ever said in any of the interviews, not George, not his collaborators. George hired a philosopher to come to his office, I think once or twice a week, and he would just sit there, and he was sitting there willing to talk with anybody about any big question that they were currently wrestling with. And so George Miller is fostering this in a team environment, but in Joni's perspective, she's doing this for the most part alone. And she was thinking through these big questions and trying to come to some level of understanding for herself so that she could put it in her music. And in order to do that, you kind of have to be open to the breakthroughs, right? Because when you're asking these big questions, when you're wrestling with huge concepts, it's not necessarily like you're going to sit down and like, obviously you can be a level of this, especially when she's writing and she's trying to figure this out. And sometimes I do this when I'm writing an essay and I'm wrestling with an idea that I'm not fully clear on. Like there's a level of like beating your head against a wall. But oftentimes where the ideas come in and where the ideas click is when you're not working, right? Like this is not revolutionary. This is known to everyone. You have your best ideas in the shower, when you're on a walk without headphones in, when you're like cleaning the dishes without headphones in. When your brain is bored, ideas just kind of bubble up to the surface. Like your brain is working in the background. And you're only able to do that if you're kind of open to these breakthroughs, right? Like again, I stress the fact of like without headphones in, because you're feeling your brain is actively listening. It's not actively processing. And so that's why you have such great ideas in the showers, because there's nothing for your brain to focus on. And so when your brain has nothing to focus on, it eventually finds something to fill in this blank. And you have to be open to the breakthroughs. You have to be open to the muse. You know, Joni was asked, like, how does a person write a song? And what Joni said was, a lot of it is just being open, I think, to encounter and in touch in a way with the miraculous. The miraculous, I think, is an interesting word to use, because I think if you're open to it, anything can be miraculous. You know, Howard Bloom, who was a guest on the show, Michael Jackson's publicist, talks about Albert Einstein a lot. Michael Jackson's former publicist, I should say. But he talks about Albert Einstein a lot. And one of Albert Einstein's rules of science is you have to look at everything under your nose as if it's the first time you've ever seen that thing. To bring this level of enthusiasm and excitement to everything that you do. And it gives you a perspective on things that someone who becomes just kind of used to it and jaded will never have. And so when Joni says with the miraculous, I think the miraculous can be anything if you have the right mindset. But really, I share that quote with you because she's talking about being open. And open to, she says miraculous, but I think it's also open to the muse. And the muse is a word, I'd use it, but she used it a lot. And it's going to come up throughout this deep dive. And just to clarify, the muse is essentially your inspiration. It is the consciousness you're tapping into. In some cases, it's God. It's whatever that thing is where inspiration comes from, essentially is what the muse is. To Joni, intellectualism is not conducive to accessing the muse, right? Like being open requires you to kind of be empty. It's kind of like what we talked about with Keith Jarrett last season. I say with Keith Jarrett, like I spoke to him, but like I just mean like when we were discussing Keith Jarrett's career. Keith Jarrett was known for doing these solo improvised concerts. He would walk out onto stage and compose 45 minutes of brand new material live and on the spot. He'd do it twice a night, 90-minute show, 45 minutes, break, 45 minutes. Completely new material. And he says the only way he was able to do that was if he was able to empty himself so there was nothing in there. There was nothing in there. He wasn't thinking about what he was going to play, how he was going to play, like the intellectual side of making something, the craft side of making something. He wasn't thinking about any of that. He was just trying to empty himself. He was trying to be open to the muse. And Joni is trying to do a very similar thing. She says, I work from intuition, so I'm always flying blind and looking to be thrilled, waiting for the magic to happen. I think it's easier to recognize the truly spectacular from an intuitive position than from your intellect, which is linear, dealing only with knowledge of the past projected into the future. I really like that last line, and I've read this so many times. I've never picked up on it. Dealing only with knowledge of the past projected into the future. That is her definition of intellectualism. And this idea of working from intuition It's easier to recognize a truly spectacular from an intuitive position, which she talked about the miraculous in the previous quote. And I was saying how you have to approach things as if you've never seen it before. If you're thinking with an intellectual brain, you know you've seen this before. It's just like rational. And in order to access the muse, where inspiration comes from, you have to be in this state of flow, essentially. Like that is where, when I say flow is when you're not thinking, you're just acting. So when it comes to Keith Jarrett doing his live performances, he's not thinking about what he's playing. He's just acting. He's in flow. And when it comes to inspiration, like even if you think about when you're in the shower, you're not really thinking much about what it is that you're doing. You're just kind of acting. Like you're a little bit on autopilot because you do it so often. So you're just kind of washing your hair. You know, you're not even thinking about it. And then boom, thought. It's like you're like microdosing flow in a weird way. That's probably not the best way to put it, but you get what I'm saying. Your brain has to be empty. You just kind of have to be operating. You have to be acting. You have to be, as Joni put, operating off of instinct. Because flow follows action. It does not follow thought. And you more often than not are going to have your breakthrough moments when you're in flow. When you're not thinking, when you're just doing. Not when you're sitting there beating your head against a wall. That gets part of the process. I think sometimes you just need to sit there and wrestle with something long enough so that your brain is just going to think about it when you're not in the chair anymore. But you need to work from an intuitive state to open yourself up to the muse, to open yourself up to be able to receive the inspiration. In order to have your best ideas, you have to not be thinking about the idea, which feels counterproductive, especially for somebody who comes from like a business background and a less creative place. But that is, and is a hard place to get to. And I'm not in that place right now. I'm not in a place, I would say, where I'm really open to the muse. Partially because I have a full-time job now, so I'm working all day and I'm like doing this show at night when I have the time. But I say it like it's my first day today. This is the day that I'm recording. This is my first official day, my first full day. And so it's not like I'm coming with a lot of experience, but like I already feel it. Whereas I don't feel open to the muse because I'm just working, coming home, eating, and then I'm recording this now. But that is not to say, but anyways, it's a difficult place to get to, being open to the muse. And you don't really get there by being intellectual. But that is not to say that intellectualism is a bad thing in the creative process. Intellect is required. Intellect is what allows you to translate the muse, right? So how Joni says is like intuition cuts through all the noise. Intellect comes in paragraphs, yada, 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 yada. And intuition comes zap, like a bolt of lightning. It comes as a pill and then has to be translated from an impulse into language by the intellect. The impulse has to be translated into language by the intellect. So intuition allows you to receive the idea, but sometimes the challenge with your ideas when you first get them, they're not tested by reality, right? Like one of the hardest things as an artist is taking this idea that's perfect in your head and bringing it into the world. Like this perfect idea, when you put it on the page, might not work. Like it's there, like the essence of what you need, what you want is there, but it's not quite right. And so that is where the intellect comes in. It allows you to kind of deal with reality, deal with the obstacles as they come up to get this idea that you had in your head out into the world. Intellectualism is not something that is bad, right? Like when we come to this, if we use art versus craft as the example again, art is this thing you have to say. You get this inspiration from the muse of this thing you want to say. And craft is what you're going to lean into, your intellect, to allow you to shape and mold this idea into something that can be shared in the world without losing the essence of what it was that inspiration was. That is where intellect comes in. And another thing that is not conducive to the muse is rushing. And so where I'm talking about, I have this full-time job now, and I'm already feeling myself kind of closing off to the muse a little bit because it's just, there's so much going on. I don't have time to just sit and be. Like, not only is intellectualism at all times closing yourself off from the muse, but rushing is closing yourself off from the muse. And I have a feeling like this isn't just a problem that I'm facing. I'm sure you or someone you know is facing that. I think we've all felt busy. We've all felt like we're just working through a to-do list, going from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And in an environment like that, there is no place to be inspired because you're just going. And to be inspired, you kind of just have to be. Just be. And I'm kind of like evaluating my life as I'm talking about this. That's what that pause was. But Joni hits on this. She goes, if you're rushing around, rushing, which we do all day long, you don't see much. But if during your rushing, you sort of rush less neurotically at a stop sign, for example, on your way rushing from point A to point B, something could come in. So what she's saying here, you don't see much. What she's saying here is like, you're not necessarily in touch with the miraculous, right? Like, you're not seeing these things under your nose as if it's the first time you're seeing them. You're just, it's all a blur. Like, you're used to it. You're just focused on going from A to B, and that's all that matters. You miss out on so much. You miss out on the muse. The muse might even be trying, but there's too much noise for it to get through. Your antenna is all the way down. But I think there's something here where there's this quote I come back to a lot. On my old podcast, I interviewed this dude named Elliot Robinson. Elliot Robinson started an Instagram account called Dunk, D-U-N-K. Had a couple million followers. It was a basketball account. So I was interviewing him about social media on this show. But he said something to me where he goes, I want to relentlessly pursue my goals calmly. And I think he said this to me in 2021. And I've been trying to reach that place. And I think that's like, I remember in 2022, I set that as the frame I wanted to have for the year, to relentlessly pursue my goals calmly. I remember my friends, I had a meeting with some friends, hanging out with some friends. And I told them this, and they're like, that's really good. We like that. And I think I've like used that every year since. And it's like, I hold on to it from like January to mid-February, and it kind of just fizzles out as life happens and you get busy and you start rushing around again. But relentlessly pursuing my goals calmly is something I come back to a lot. Or I haven't read the book yet, but Slow Productivity, which is this concept by Cal Newport, which is like, we are so obsessed with daily productivity in today's world. How much should I do today? I need to cram my day. I need to be filling it with so much stuff. But slow productivity is like, what is your output in a year? And I think that our daily productivity stressor actually can limit our total output for the course of a year, because we get so focused on filling our days with stuff to make us ourselves feel productive. We're adding in things that don't actually matter, that don't contribute to the big goals. And so our slow productivity goals aren't even achieved, right? Like for me, I have this daily to-do list of everything I have to do in a day, whether it's this new job I have or whether it was the clients I used to have. It's like, I got these things done, I got to do the podcast stuff done. Like that takes up a whole day. And so I never necessarily think about, I do actually on occasion think about like the longer term, like how many of these podcasts do I want to do in a year? Like it's not just about what you do in a day, but I think that our days just become so filled with stuff, we can kind of lose the forest for the trees and lose the things that are actually important. And it's okay. I don't know if you do this, but I know I do this. When there's gaps in your schedule, it's okay not to fill them. But because of this feeling of always being busy and always rushing, I have this like compulsion to do that. And I'll like come up with things for Artwell that I just got to do them because I have the time, but it's not the main thing. And so, long tangent to say that rushing is not conducive to the muse. If you want to open yourself up to inspiration, you have to find little pockets or longer pockets, if you can, in your day or your week to slow down, to do nothing, to just sit and be, which is like a novel thing to do in today's world. Like even, sorry, I'm like so stuck on this point, but even like when you're waiting in line somewhere, like that was a place you used to be accessible. The muse used to be able to access you, but now you're on your phone. The muse can't really penetrate your phone. Your phone creates a force field, and we're always on it. We're always doing something. We're never doing nothing. But you need to be open to receiving the muse. And well, you can't, it's like this weird, I was going to say you have to choose to be open, and you do, but you can't have expectations when you're open. You can't be thinking about the fact that you're open. That's also not conducive. But the muse is there. You just have to make sure you're open to it. But the challenging thing with the muse is that the muse is not on a schedule. Like, yes, you have to be open to the muse, but the weird thing about that is by being open to the muse, you're not thinking about the muse. If that makes any sense. Like, you can't sit there and be like, okay, I'm ready, muse. Hit me with inspiration. Like, the act of thinking about the muse is counter to how the muse works. The muse will visit you when it's ready. The muse will visit you when you least expect it. And being open to it means when it visits you when you're not thinking about it, are you able to be receptive to what it is providing to you? That is what being open to the muse means. Thinking about the muse and wanting the muse to visit you is going to keep the muse away. But also, even sometimes when you are open and when you're not thinking about it, it's still not going to visit you. You're going to come to periods where you just don't know what to say. You don't know what to write, what to make. You're going to have writer's block. This happens to everyone. Even somebody as prolific as Joni Mitchell. She comes into periods in her career where she just doesn't know what to say. She doesn't have anything to say. And she was asked if that's a frustrating thing. And she said, I never get frustrated to the point where I'll say, quit writing. I come to dry periods where either I feel I don't have anything new to say or feel like I'm repeating patterns. And that last part, repeating patterns, I think is really important. Because what I think she's saying there is something very much along the lines of this art versus craft thing we've been talking about, or really that Bob Dylan example, where he felt like he hadn't written a new song in a while. He was just writing songs, like he'd fallen back on the craft, on the skill he was good at, but he wasn't really expressing anything with it. I think that's what Joni is saying here, where she says she doesn't feel like she has anything new to say when she's repeating patterns. And by repeating patterns, what I think she's saying is that she's falling back onto things she knows she's good at. She's falling back into the skill set she's developed, this craft that she's good at, but because she has nothing new to say, she's falling back into that craft to say similar things like that she's already said in a similar way that she said them. And so she can tell when she's doing that she doesn't have actually anything worthy to express. And for her, there was no point in doing that. Like for Joni, she knew when she had something new to say, she would be pushing her craft, her art into new areas in order to find the best way to express this new thing in a new way. And I think that's actually a really interesting idea. Is like, one, not only was she didn't want to rehash old work. You know, she would constantly say throughout her career, like, I never wanted to become a human jukebox. Or like people just ask me for the songs they want and the style they want, and I'm just going to play them. Like that was never her thing. But I like the idea of your work being an exploration. Like there's an idea of like, is what you're doing, a question to ask yourself, I guess, in the process, is what you're doing new territory? Like, are you trying something new with this thing, or are you just rehashing what you've always done? Because your art should be an adventure. It should be fun for you. There's this Jordan Peele interview I was watching where he says something where it's like, if you are not having like the time of your life when you're writing a screenplay, you're doing it wrong. Like this thing should be fun. Right? Like this is something that we used to do as kids for the sake of it. Like we just loved doing that thing, so we did it. And then when it starts to become, when you grow up, and whether it be you start to earn money from this thing, or you've been trying to earn money from this thing and it's just not happening for you, you have this tendency to become like jaded and pessimistic, or it becomes more about the money than the art itself. And that's never the reason why you started doing any of this. Right? Like the reason we make things is for the fun of making them. And if you've lost that fun, you're doing it wrong. And part of what makes I think doing things, making art so fun is exploring new territory. And so Joni was talking about this, and she said, the only time I really play an instrument is to explore it. Sometimes I'm going to have to play my instruments to rehearsal material. That's drudgery to me in a way. That's work. That's the piano lessons as a child. That's practice, practice, practice. But the time that I enjoy playing the most is like I'll sit down late at night and tune my guitar into a tuning which I'm unfamiliar with, so I have the unknown in front of me. And so when I say you want to explore your craft, I Googled what exploration means in Merriam-Webster in the dictionary. It says to travel over new territory for adventure or discovery. And so that's why I say your writing, your art should be an adventure. It should be you going into new territory, trying something new, pushing yourself as an artist, because otherwise you're just repeating what you've already done. And I don't think when you were a child, you picked up a pen for the first time, you picked up a camera just to keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And speaking of exploration, Joni would often travel between projects. A couple key stories that come to play is come to mind, I should say, is when she wrote Blue, she took a trip to Greece and kind of over Europe. And when she wrote Hejira, she did a road trip across the United States. And the experiences she had in those two trips enforced her entire albums. Like when I talked about in the introduction, or like the short biography of Joni Mitchell that I wrote at the beginning of this, I said how after Ladies of the Canyon, her third studio album, she felt like she was too famous, or fame was coming too quickly, I should say. And so she kind of just jettisoned off to Greece. And it was that trip to Greece where she got a lot of the material for Blue, and Blue became one of the greatest albums ever written, ever made. And she just needed that time away to find her creativity again. Because where she says she feels like she's running out of things to say she comes to dry periods when she runs out of things to say. The best way to get new things to say is to have new experiences. And I think that's the problem. I've talked about this before, but like the problem with the way in a social media world is, at least for me, I feel like I'm always making things. Like I don't have the time to have new experiences, because anytime I do have, I feel like I should be working on this thing, and then it's not giving me new stuff to talk about. And, you can become, in Joni's case, actually, I think it was around this time she got feedback that like she was starting to make music about being a singer and on the road. And that's not relatable to many people. You see it's comedians who tour too often. They start having jokes about being a comedian on the road. Like, you won't have anything to express if you are only making things. And so if you feel like you're running out of new things to say, step away from the art for a little bit, go live your life, have experiences, and then come back to the work with fresh perspectives, because your art gets its life from yours. That is where it comes from. Your art is not going to find new life if you are only sitting at the same place, surrounded by the same four walls every single day. You need to get out into the world. This idea actually reminds me of something else that I spoke about with John Colley, the screenwriter. And he was saying how an issue we're running into with film today is so many films are being mediated by films from the 20th century. Like, so many people become inspired to make movies because they watch so many movies, and now they're writing movies based on the movies that they've watched. They're not writing movies based on their own experiences. And for him, that's something so core to who he is. Like, John was a traveling doctor. He's been to the front lines of war zones. He's worked in rural Africa. Like, John has been all over the world, and he took those experiences and then put them into his work. And if he doesn't have an experience that is necessary to what it is he's writing, he will go out and have that experience. So, for example, he wrote this film that involved ice climbing. So we have like picks, and you're climbing up a sheet of ice on the side of a mountain. And John went out and did that. He got the real life experience so that he was able to talk about it in his script in a way that was authentic, in a way that people could feel. lived experience is so important. I'm not going to get this quote right, but there's this interview I've seen with Denzel Washington, and he was talking about different directors. And it was, I don't remember what the movie is, but I think it was a movie about black characters directed by a black man. And I think the question was along lines of like, could another director have made this movie? And Denzel Washington effectively says like, no, another director couldn't have made this movie. Like Steven Spielberg could not have directed this the same way. I don't remember the director of the movie. Our director couldn't have made Schindler's List. And it's not a black versus white thing. It is an experience thing. Like Steven Spielberg, I'm also, if you're watching this on YouTube, I am also not black. So I haven't had these experiences, but he said something to the effect of like, Steven Spielberg has never felt a warm comb on his head in a barbershop. Like it's not a black versus white thing. It's an experience, a lived experience thing. And that is why this person needed to direct this movie, because he's had the experience. He knows the characters, he knows the audience because he's been them. And that is just such an important thing to me, is lived experience, because your art gets its life from yours. And so Joni actually, this is an amalgamation of quotes. I put a couple together here, but this is her talking about why she decided to basically, as her career starting to take off, to run away from it all. She said, I'd like to take a bit of a sabbatical to keep my life alive and keep my writing alive. That is a perfect summation of everything I'm trying to say to you. If you are not living a life that makes you feel alive, then your writing is going to feel dead. That, perfect. And she said, because if I tour regularly, constantly, I'm afraid that my experience will be too limited to the experience of the applause and the hotel room. I was being isolated, started to feel like a bird in a gilded cage. I wasn't getting a chance to meet people. A certain amount of success cuts you off in a lot of ways. You can't move freely. I like to live, be on the streets, to be in the crowd and moving freely. And for her, I like to live, to be in the streets, to be in the crowd. That's where the stories are. And so you need to make sure that, yes, I understand, and I am incredibly guilty of this, of putting the work in. You have to do that. But there's a point, especially as an artist, where that eventually makes your well run dry. And you need to get back out there. You need to live life. You need to have experiences. You need to be on the streets. You need to be in the crowd. You need to be alive to keep your writing alive. Now, of course, we have to caveat this. I'm going to contradict what I just said when it comes to you have to be there, because Joni Mitchell wrote a song called Woodstock. It is considered by many to be the greatest song about Woodstock. It captures the ethos of that generation in a way that nobody else was able to do. And Joni Mitchell didn't actually get to go to Woodstock. She was supposed to. She was scheduled to perform at Woodstock, actually, along with Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And the only problem was the following day, she was set to make her national TV debut on the Dick Cavett Show. And so her manager, David Geffen, basically made the call like, look, Joni, we're not sending you in to this festival with like 400,000 people in the mud. Like, that's no place for you to go. We want to make sure you're here in New York for the taping of the show tomorrow. Unfortunately for Joni, so she didn't get to go to Woodstock. And there was this like longing in her, this like sadness that she was feeling that she was able to put into words in a way that captured Woodstock. Like, she basically wrote about what she thought Woodstock would be, and she ended up getting it so right that it became the song that defined a generation and basically defined Woodstock. She said, I wouldn't have been able to, and so this is, again, counter to a couple of things, counter to the fact that live your life, have experiences in order to be able to write. And you could argue, though, that this is, in a way, an experience, right? Like, Joni is writing about, and if you listen to the song, it's quite melancholic. And I think the only reason the song is able to have that tone is because she didn't actually get to go to Woodstock. Like, she even said herself, I wouldn't have been able to write it if I had been there, because I would have been caught up in the backstage neurosis. I ended up in the position of the fan who couldn't go, so I could be more romantic about it than I could have been if I had been there and caught up in the reality of it. So she was able to look at Woodstock with these like rose-tinted glasses. So she had a very unique lens about this event. She basically, because to her point, like she wasn't there, she wasn't caught up in the backstage politics and everything, it allowed her to write about only the good parts of Woodstock that people there experienced. But the people who didn't go could see those things, like Joni could see these good things, and that's all she was left with. Because she wasn't there, she wasn't left with any of the bad stuff. She was left with no baggage. She wasn't left trying to figure out how to get out of Woodstock with 400,000 other people. She wasn't covered in mud because it had rained. Like, she was only writing about the good parts, the parts that people want to remember. And so again, it's very counter to the fact of like, you have to live something in order to write about it. But there's something here with this idea that I've been wrestling with for a while. I interviewed Baron Ryan, who originally rose to, we'll say, fame through TikTok. He makes short films on TikTok. He wrote a book called A Comedy of Nobodies, I believe is what it's called. And he just premiered back in April his first feature film. I don't think it's available yet because actually they premiered it, but then they went back and shot a few additional scenes. So they're still working on it. But I interviewed him around the time that I interviewed him a week before he premiered his film, but his collection of short stories had already been published. And what he said about the collection of short stories is like they're very much inspired by his life, but he was more so writing from the way he wished things had happened, like this idealistic perspective of the college experience. And I thought that was an interesting frame where it's like there's still an authenticity to what he's saying. Like there's some real life experience that is influencing these stories, but the direction they take is different. And I like that idea of writing how you wish things had happened. And there's another conversation I had with an artist. His name is Kubla. He's a friend of mine. He's a singer-songwriter based here in Toronto. And he told me once he wrote a song about driving the Pacific Coast Highway in California. But the thing is, he'd never actually done that. So he was writing how he thinks it would feel to drive on the Pacific Coast Highway. But this is an important distinction I'm going to try to make here. He wasn't writing pretending like he had ridden on the Pacific Coast Highway. He was writing it very much in the perspective of how Joni Mitchell wrote about Woodstock, of like, I've never done this, but it must be what it feels like. Like, this is the thing I'm missing, and this is how I'm picturing it in my brain. Like, it's still coming from an authentic place. He's not writing it from, this is definitely how it feels like, I'm trying to pretend I know because I've seen other people talk about it. He's like, no, this is how I think it feels. This is how it feels to me as an outsider. So it's still coming from an authentic place. And so you could argue that all of this is still lived experience. Like, Joni is writing about Woodstock from the perspective of somebody who didn't get to go to Woodstock. But I just think that that's interesting. This idea of writing the way you wish things had gone, or writing how you think things would feel to you, because that still imbues it with some level of life. Like, there's still something in there that connects deeply to your core. And what's interesting when you think about Joni Mitchell, the fact, one, she wrote Woodstock, but she also wrote a lot of songs that were considered to have captured America, especially in this time period, the late 60s, 70s, even into the 80s, that she captured America in a way that was very distinct, very unique, but she's not American. Joni Mitchell was born in Calgary, grew up in Saskatchewan, Saskatoon. And she was actually asked about this in an interview once. And she said so the interviewer asked, does it ever strike you as strange that Canadians such as yourself and Leonard Cohen and Neil Young have made some of the most powerful music about America? And Joni didn't skip a beat. She didn't even say, no, I don't think it's strange. She literally just said, fresh eyes. Hockney made great paintings of LA. The Swiss photographer Frank documented America in the 50s at a time when nobody noticed how culturally peculiar it was. People sometimes don't know what's happening under their noses. And I just love this idea that in order to capture something purely, you need fresh eyes. And that's another reason why Joni would like retreat in order to write. She wrote in solitude. She would wait for time to pass so that she could have fresh eyes, a fresh perspective on what she had gone through. And she would often go back to her house in British Columbia in order to write. Like, she would live in the city, she would have the experiences that would inform her writing, and then she would take those experiences and these ideas, and she would go into the middle of nowhere, Canada. She would work on those ideas in isolation, and she would write them from a fresh perspective, and then she would put that art into the world. Like that was kind of her cycle a little bit. And this process of Joni, kind of retreating to write was very effective. It allowed her to write some incredibly beautiful music. But the problem is there's trade-offs that come with that, right? Like we talked about this extensively last time out with Keith Jarrett of the trade-offs that he had to make in order to be successful, even physically, right? Like just the way he played piano was so physically taxing that in his old age, he had problems with his hands. His back was so bad, he had to travel with his own mattress because his back was so messed up from the way in which he played the piano, because he was so physically demanding. And he's considered great because of the things he did and how he played the piano, but there was trade-offs with that. Greatness does not come without a cost. And for Joni, she said, I'm very prolific, but I'm also very lonely, which is one of the dues you pay, right? Like if you're retreating to write, that means you're leaving everything behind and everyone behind in order to go do this thing. It was very effective for her to write, but it wasn't necessarily conducive to maintaining a lot of relationships. But that is, if you truly have this desire to be successful, to be great, you have to make those trade-offs. And truthfully, celebrity is not really, I'm going to use the word conducive again, is not really conducive to expressing yourself as an artist, right? Like celebrities has a lot of parties, a lot of keeping appearances, a lot of politics, like so much other stuff you have to do and think of that isn't actually your art. And we even see it today, this is a bit of a different thing, but like you see movie studios wanting you to have a certain amount of followers in order for you to get cast in movies so you can promote the film. And it's like, I understand where the studio is coming from, but like if you're an artist truly trying to be great at what you do, you shouldn't have to worry about social media. You should worry about having to make the greatest movies possible. But instead of doing that, you have to worry about growing your social media and doing like bullshit trends in order to get people to pay attention to you so that studios will cast you. Like, there's so much other stuff that gets in the way of making your art. And celebrity is one of the biggest things that get in the way of that. But we're lucky to have someone like Joni Mitchell who never really cared much for celebrity. She always put the work first, even very much like to the I don't want to say detriment of her career, but we'll use that word, to the detriment of her career, especially in the late 70s into the 80s, right? Where she is experimenting with new sounds. She's kind of pushing into this jazz world with her music and she made great music, but commercially it wasn't hitting. Like her audience wasn't really appreciative of it. Her label wasn't really pushing it because it wasn't commercial. And so, but it never really deterred her. You could say into the 80s, she made a little bit more mainstream stuff, but for the most part, for Joni Mitchell, it was always about putting the work first. And one of the other issues she constantly ran into with her management was like, you have to write a single. Like, write us a single for this album, Joni. Like, we need something we can put out there, something that's going to chart. She did it once with her 5th studio album, For the Roses. She made a You Turn Me On a Radio. And that song charted really well. I think actually also helped me on Court and Spark, her 6th album, also did well in the charts. But for the most part, especially off her early albums, like she didn't really have high chart topping singles. And her label was like, please just write us one. But the problem with that is that Joni wasn't just writing a collection of songs and putting them together. Her albums are stories. She would often describe them almost like as novels. Like they are very intentionally sequenced, very intentionally written. Like there is a story there for you to follow. And so if she was to just write a single for the sake of writing a single, that wouldn't necessarily fit with this story that she's telling. And I love her commitment to this because I feel like this is something we've lost quite a bit. You see often, at least I see this anecdotally. I'll go on Spotify, I'll find a singer I really like, I'll click on their profile, and they've just released a bunch of singles. And sometimes they've released a bunch of singles, but they put out an album and you click on the album and it's like just all of the singles that did really well. for the most part, with a couple of new songs in there. But it's like, you're not telling a story. You're just kind of putting some songs together and putting this thing out. And I understand times are changing, but like just the way that I like to consume music, I'm very much an album guy. I'm a front to back, listen to the album. I want to hear this entire experience that the artist intended. And sometimes the artist didn't intend for you to have an experience, and that's kind of a disappointing album to listen to. But when you listen to something like Blue, which is very much a story, or even like a recent example, Chromacopia, Tyler the Creator, I know I talk about him a lot, but I'm just a fan. And we don't really get that anymore as much. But Joni, this was something she was very much intentionally did. And it often did not create an environment for chart-topping singles, because that was not her focus. Being famous, being a celebrity was not something she paid too much attention to. But when she talked about putting together an album, she said, in the course of a year, I usually have 10 to 14 songs. So probably 3 of them are weaker. Either that or they don't pertain to some sort of story continuity, because the album, I feel, hopefully in the course of a year, is more than just a collection of songs. It has some sort of continuity or thread to it. I like to think that it's almost like a novel. I try as much as possible to link up the songs. There's a musical connection one to the other, and also a thematic connection. And I also like to, just the idea that there is this thematic connection throughout the entire album, but also that she kind of capped herself at like 12 songs, 11 songs, because she said she'll write 10 to 14 songs in a year, and usually 3 of them are weaker. And those weak songs wouldn't make it onto the album. She would only make it her best stuff. And this is my opposite gripe with the current state of music is, one, it's either all singles, or you'll see somebody put out like a 22 song album, which is just insane. Like the restrictions of albums, and like with a CD can only hold up to 80 minutes of music, which is even still a lot. But like there were restrictions with the old technology we used in order to distribute music that forced artists to cut their weak stuff and only give you their best stuff on an album. But now with something like Spotify and streaming services, you can make your album as long as you want. Mac DeMarco has like a 109 song album. And here's the thing. And again, because I'm such like not only am I a front to back album person, like I'm very much a storyteller. Like I am just drawn to stories, whether it be in film, whether it be in stand-up comedy. Like setup punchline comedians are funny, but to me, the stuff that resonates the most with me is like these stories, is funny stories. That's what I am drawn to. I am drawn to a well-lit, crafted story, and that's what I'm looking for in an album. And so if you put out a 22 song album, if that is intentionally crafted and you're telling a story that required 22 songs to tell, cool. I have no problem with that. But if you put out 22 songs just because you made 50 songs this year and these 22 were like kind of the good ones, I don't respond to that. Like if you took the example, the name I'm thinking of in my head right now is Morgan Wallen, who's a country artist. And he put out these huge albums and I like listen to them and I'm like, there's some really good songs on here. But there's also some not great songs. Like if he took his album and he cut it from like 22 to 12 or 14 songs, like that could be a phenomenal album with like no skips whatsoever. Instead of spending half my time skipping half the songs because I don't want to listen to them. And again, I know art is subjective, and so some of the songs I hate, somebody else might love, but like it also doesn't feel like there's a cohesive story happening. And I haven't really listened to his new stuff because it kind of feels like it's becoming more about craft. Like he's gotten really good at writing songs as a country artist and he's not even writing all of them himself. I understand that. But it just feels like it's falling back to like write a song about being sad in a small town. And he's really good at that, but like that's kind of what he's doing. And so I'm losing the plot a little bit here when it comes to album sequencing. But my biggest thing is like just tell a story with it. You know, whatever it is you're doing, I think people will respond to it better if there's an intentional story to what it is you're making. And Joni was, of course, phenomenal at that. Like I said, Blue I love, but everybody loves Blue. Again, the Rolling Stone named it as their 3rd greatest album of all time. And so Joni was a master. But one thing she said too, interestingly, when it comes to the songs on her album, like yes, she's looking for this like thematic connection, this musical connection with her work, but she also said on every album there's usually 1 or 2 tunes, maybe only one, that's the forerunner of the next movement. She was already in her process of making that album, she would stumble onto new things that she would want to explore more on future projects, but she would just kind of include that in her album to kind of tease the new sound she's got coming, to kind of prime her audience for what's going to come next. And now, I like that as an idea. In Joni Mitchell's case, again, it didn't necessarily work the greatest when she's starting to tease some jazz stuff. It's not like her audience was like, all right, she's going to make jazz. Now, her jazz stuff kind of alienated people, but I do like that as an idea of just slowly easing your audience into the new thing, right? I've talked about on the show, the best way to get people something new is within a context they're familiar with. Take the thing people expect, experiment with it a little bit so you can kind of slowly ease people into the new thing. And that's what Joni was doing with her albums. And she was teasing new sound in every single one, just kind of subtly letting her audience know where she's going to be heading. But the question then becomes is like, okay, like she's got this new sound, but she's not doing it in like, she's not like, okay, this album's going to be like my folky one. This one's going to be a bit more folk rock. This one's going to be just rock. Then we're going to get into jazz. Like she's not laying it out like that because like we talked about, for her, it's an exploration. She's like looking for the new thing. Like she's going to push herself into unknown territory in order to find the new, right? But that's not necessarily an easy thing to do because the hard part with finding the new is you don't actually know what it is that you're looking for, like until you found it. Joni said, intellectually, you may not know what you want, but you know what you don't want. That's not it. We're getting there. So intellect being basically your data bank, what you already know, but you don't know what you want because you want something fresh. So how do you describe something fresh? You're going to have to stumble on it. You have to set up a climate so that you'd be able to stumble on it. And the interviewer, Malcolm Aram, asked her, how do you do that? She says, you make accidents occur, drive the operators crazy because they think you lost your marbles. Some of the things that you do to get your cork going, trying to think in other ways. Those are the things that make them think you've lost your marbles. And there's a couple of interesting ideas in there I want to pull out. The first one being this idea of, in order to find the new, you just have to avoid what you don't want until you find it. Like it's this process of elimination. You're kind of just wandering around in the dark. You're going to stumble on a thing to like, oh no, we've done that. That's familiar. Okay, what about over here? What if we tried this? And eventually you're going to find the thing. But I like that being an idea of like, you're not trying to find the new. You're just eliminating the things you don't want until you find the thing that you do, which can be a taxing process and can be challenging, but is part of the process, part of finding the new. But I also like the idea of inverting to find the new. This is another thing Joni talked about. And inversion is this mental model. I'm not going to do a great job of explaining it, but essentially it's how would you normally do something? Okay, what if we did the exact opposite of that thing? What are the results? Like, what does that do? And the famous example is Charlie Munger, who's this investor. And he says, I just have to figure out where I'm going to die and I'm never going to go there. Like, how can I do the opposite of what most people do? It's like, instead of trying to stay alive, like, how can I just avoid where I die? It's a joke example, but you kind of get the point that I'm saying here. And for Joni, she would often try to do this with her music. She said that, I don't really want to write right now. The kind of material I want to write, I want it to be brighter, to get people up, to grab them. So I'm stifling any feelings of solitude or certain moods I might ordinarily develop into a song. I steer away from that now because I don't want that kind of material to perform. And so Joni, this is kind of similar along the lines of like, you know what it is you don't want, which is everything you've done before. And so that's what you're saying here. When she would stumble onto those things that she has done before, writing about feelings of solitude or certain moods, she would course correct and try to be a little bit more brighter in her material. And this is interesting, right? It's just basically whenever you do, your intention is to set out to do something different. And whenever you start to catch yourself going back to the old way, you have to course correct. And that is going to force you to try new things. It's essentially breaking her process, which is this idea I'm really obsessed with of you have a certain way you do something, but what would it look like if you did your process in the opposite way? Like an example with this podcast, and it's a brave thing to do because I don't necessarily, breaking your process is a brave thing to do. Because like with this podcast, for example, is I do a ton of research. I do a ton of notes. So I'm sure if you're watching on YouTube, you can see me reading them off this entire time. But what would it look like if I did the show with no notes? How would that change? What would the show sound like? What would the examples I pull from sound like? Or there's this example I think it was Coltrane once, who would play the saxophone in a completely different way just to see what kind of sounds he could make. And for Joni here it's kind of similar. It's like, this is how I always write a song, kind of very sad, but what if I made it happy? Then what would that sound like? I would use different words. I would probably have to write in a different place, and that is going to lead to different things. But the challenging thing, I say challenging, but this is actually part of it and why you would do it in this way. When you break your process, you're naturally not going to be as good as the normal way you do things, right? Because if you're doing it in a completely new way, you're not going to be quite as skilled. There's going to be hiccups. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be things you didn't mean to happen that happen. But the catch is that those are the things that you're actually wanting to happen. In breaking your process, you want to have the accidents. By breaking your process, you're going to create an environment where accidents are more likely to occur. And as we've talked about, it is the magic accidents that you're looking for. And when you're open to the muse, you also need to be open to these accidents. If you get too rigid into this is how we do things, it closes you off from the happy accidents. One of Joni's collaborators was Wayne Shorter, a famous saxophonist. And she was saying a genius like Wayne is always exploring. So he's going to be more inconsistent. He's going to be all over the place because he's going into new territory. The great things nearly always come on the edge of an error. What comes after the error is spectacular. So if you are hung up on the error, you missed the magic. If you're hung up on a concept, then when a lucky accident happens, you're still stuck in the tunnel vision of, no, that's not what I wanted. So you're approaching it intellectually and not fluid enough or open enough to see this is better than what I had in mind and go with it. I think it takes a degree of alertness and fluidity, right? You have to be open to the magic that presents itself on the day. You have to do all of the preparation. You have to do all of the intellectual work to get you to a point where you can just forget everything and go make. You have to prepare to forget everything you know. It sounds very counterproductive, right? Especially, and I understand this is how my brain works. I feel like my brain has a tendency to be intellectual over fluid, but that's what all the hard work you're doing beforehand is. You're getting so good at the craft so that when you're in the process and a new opportunity presents itself, something opens up, the muse hits you, you can adapt to that on the fly. That is the whole purpose of getting good at the craft, not for the craft itself, but in order to allow you to capture these thoughts, these feelings, these ideas that you never could have planned for. She also says something where the great things nearly always come on the edge of an error. And when she also says what comes after an error is spectacular, what she's saying is you might have a mistake, but that mistake might sound good. And so that's gonna put you in a new direction. That's why you want to break your process. But when she's saying here, the great things nearly always come on the edge of an error, it's very similar to what Keith Jarrett talked about last season, where he says, you want to always be dancing on the edge. And dancing on the edge, I think, has many different connotations, many different interpretations. And some of the ones that we talked about last time out was dancing on the edges of what is known and unknown is one interpretation. Dancing on the edge of being good or making a mistake is another interpretation of it. I think that's what Joni is getting at here with Wayne Shorter, who also is a jazz saxophonist. Keith was a jazz piano player. So maybe there's something just with the jazz mindset that allows you to be more open to these mistakes that happen on the day. But I have a Keith Jarrett quote here where he's talking about this and of being open and preparing to forget everything you know. He says, I think you have to be completely without mercy with yourself. You can't say something like, I did this yesterday before I played the concert, and the concert was great, therefore I should do that again. Anything that creates a pattern creates an anchor. First, it's conscious, and then it's unconscious. When it's unconscious, it isn't only an anchor, it's a habit. It is the things you know you're good at. It's the territory you've walked over before. It is your craft. And in order to find the new, you can't rely on those things. You have to move away from those things. You have to be without mercy for yourself. You can't let yourself settle if you want to find new things to express artistically. You can't stick to old habits. And Joni Mitchell was definitely somebody who refused to stick to old habits. Thank you so much for listening to part 1 of my deep dive into the life and career of Joni Mitchell. I'm going to be uploading part 2 next week, so if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. If you want to get even more out of Artwell, then I recommend you subscribe to the Artwell newsletter. Once the deep dive is over, once I put out part 1 and part 2, I'm going to be sending out a newsletter that has all of the lessons that we talked about written as these short little one-liners, these maxims to help make them memorable. You can subscribe to the Artwell newsletter now at the link in the show notes. And now, go do your thing. And whatever it is, do it well.